Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the theatre here. And we are going to kick today off with a question that could hardly be in some ways grander nor more important. Who does our political system benefit? A couple of thoughts from me about where we are. I mean, in a sense, this question, who does the political system benefit, in a sense is the cardinal, the central question of politics. And if one thing depresses me about politics at the moment, it's that we have had, over the last, 5, 6, 7 years, we've had this period where politics has been in the spotlight. It has been the thing that people want to talk to you about. When I've been up and down the country, as I often am, and people either recognize me or they ask, what do you do? And I say, I'm a political journalist. And they give you this look. It's like, oh, it's like the sort of look they might give an undertaker, right? And in a sense, we can do a bit of that. But it's this sort of like curious mix of fascination and intrigue and also slight horror. And it would always be followed by, oh, you must be busy. And the answer is, of course, right, because we've lived through this process of a period where there's actually been almost radicalization in the country. People have been radicalized by politics. People who haven't been political before suddenly are. And yet, despite all of that, and perhaps because of it, as we head to the next general election, which is 14 months away now, there is so little big thinking, so little big picture from either of the two parties or the two main party principals, the two party leaders, about the big questions of what our politics ought to look like. And if you, like me, find that depressing, then the good news is that in the course of the next hour or so, we're going to put pay to it a little bit with a conversation that I'm sure is going to be completely fascinating. So, will you put your hands together and give a very warm welcome to our panel, Magid, Scarlett, Westbrook, Amber Rudd, and Tom Brake. So, I think the best place to start is, of course, the beginning, and start with that question. Panel, this little parlour. As you like, my chair's very large, isn't it? It's very good. I did ask for a bigger one, but this is all that they could provide. Let's start with that question. Who does our political system benefit? And rather than me doing it, just introduce yourself to the audience, just in case any of them might not know who you are. Perish the thought. Tom, let's start with you, given your next name.
Thank you. So I'm Tom Brake. I'm the director of an organisation called Unlock Democracy, which campaigns for democratic reforms in the UK, and previously a member of Parliament and a minister in the coalition government. In terms of who does the present system benefit, the answer is a very small minority of voters. Current polls suggest that 90% of people think that the government doesn't represent them, or they have very little influence over government. And so it is a benefit to very few voters, but clearly it is often of benefit to the majority party and often to their supporters and potentially their donors. Magid?
Hello, my name is Magid. I currently lead a European climate organisation called Union of Justice. Formerly Mayor of Sheffield and MEP for the wonderful constituency of Yorkshire and the Humber. And I guess, for me, to answer the question is, not everybody does it benefit. For me, it kind of really benefits those who've got a better access to the political power, and specifically those who've also got the resources to influence policy and legislation. So, comes to mind is, of course, your donors, your corporations, and yes, as much as we get told, yes, political fundamentally kind of comes down to the ballot box and it kind of benefits us the most. I don't really think that's the case. And of course, we'll get into, how we can kind of fix that in terms of voting system, devolution, education, all sorts of parts. But I guess the crooked answer is not everyone.
Amber?
So I'm Amber Rudd. I was a Member of Parliament between 2010 and 2019, and I was in Cabinet for 4 of those years under David Cameron, Theresa May, and very briefly under Boris Johnson. And I think the answer to the question is it works best for people who engage with it. And it can be hard for people to engage with it. And in that respect, that might be where we could go and talk about and try and deliver some sort of reform. But I'm incredibly proud of our democracy. It actually has been very robust in the face of some quite big challenges. It has dealt with bad leadership, corrupt leadership, and it has ejected people. So I think that we have a strong democracy, but it works best for people who engage with it. And I think that's the same at local level, probably at mayoral level, Magid, and certainly at government level.
Scott.
Hi, my name is Scarlett Westbrook. I'm 19 years old. I'm one of the people who set up the school climate strikes and also currently the youngest parliamentary policy writer. I did an A-level in 2019, or 18 even, when I was 13, making me the youngest person to an A-level in government and politics. I think that the political system only really benefits a tiny elite, so echoing what some other people here have said, I think there's so many access barriers to getting involved with politics, and even then, the people currently in charge don't really want to listen to the electorate or to others who are trying to engage with it.
Scott, I'm not sure whether they're applauding you or everybody, but let's go along with the idea that it's everybody.
I like to think so.
Just to make people feel good about themselves. I'm struck that you all suggested in one form or another that the political system benefits those with access, it benefits those who are able to wield influence through it. Is there a political system for which that would not be true, for which that would not be the case, or would be less of the case than it is now? Because you can imagine a situation in which virtually all political systems, through all time, benefit those with access, benefit those who know how to maneuver or use the system in some way.
So I think that when I say it benefits those who engage with it, I start from the fact that people have to vote. So famously, people who are older tend to vote more than people who are younger. I think that may be changing because I think that the Brexit referendum politicized a lot of young people in a way that they hadn't been before. So I think that people are engaged. I'm not saying it's exclusive, or particularly just for small groups of people. Everybody is engaged when it comes to elections, and that's, again, I say it's not just MPs, it's also council elections and mayoral elections. So there is an opportunity for everybody to be engaged, and the point is their voices have to be part of that in order for politicians to listen and deliver for them.
But also, I mean, you talked about the idea that our democracy had been strong in recent years. Now, there may be a lot of people, and I could imagine if we were having a slightly different conversation, you might think this as well, given that you were at the absolute coalface of it during the Brexit years, for example. Our democracy didn't feel very strong then, did it?
No.
At all. It felt quite brittle.
I don't think brittle, but I mean, it was certainly tested. I mean, what you have had over the Brexit vote and then the chaos of the next few years when Theresa May tried to deliver a Brexit deal was the clash between direct democracy of a referendum, where the UK voted to leave the EU, and parliamentary democracy, where you couldn't actually reach an agreement because most MPs did not want to deliver the sort of hard Brexit that looked like was the reasonable one for the Brexiteers. So it was certainly tested, but I come back to the fact that even though it had the most difficult few years, as you said in your introduction, and there were really ugly parts to be part of myself. You know, I found it incredibly difficult sometimes, and you get a lot of personal abuse and challenges to what you're doing.
Do you still?
Less now. I'm hoping that this doesn't escalate it, though.
We'll see, won't we?
But I think it worked. It worked because it delivered, it may have delivered a man who I didn't support, Boris Johnson, but it also ejected him. Then we had Liz Truss, and she was ejected. So actually, I think our democracy worked.
Tom?
You were talking earlier about ways in which you could change the system to make people of power or with money less able to influence it. Well, clearly there are ways in which you could do that. So, for instance, putting a much lower cap on how much money someone can donate to a political party. If people are donating £1 million to a political party, they are expecting something in return. They're not doing it as a charitable jest. So you can do that. You can put in place much tougher controls around lobbying, so you get much more transparency over who is lobbying whom, and information that's available quickly. So if you can see that a government minister is consulting or meeting with 15 organisations from the oil and gas industry, but hasn't actually ever met a single organisation from an organisation like Friends of the Earth, then you can bring pressure to bear to make that system more effective. And just on the question of democracy, I think what has broken in the UK is politics. It's not democracy. I think democracy is strong in the UK, and there has been some backsliding in recent years, particularly over the, attempts to shut down Parliament. But I was at an event a couple of days ago with Roger Cohen, who's a journalist on the New York Times, and he was saying, if you think democracy is broken in the West in particular, how come there aren't people queuing at the border, the Russian border, the Chinese border, and the North Korean border, who are desperate to get into those countries to benefit from the freedoms and the civil liberties that they offer?
And that it can all be true, and yet in the last British Social Attitude Survey, 50% of people agreed with the statement that it doesn't matter who you vote for, nothing will ever change. And so, how do we reconcile those two things? Because yes, democracy may be preferable, clearly, to autocracy or anything else, but there is huge disillusionment.
That's the weakness of the politicians, not of democracy.
See, I would tie them together, politics and democracy. So I guess for me, just touching back on what Amber was saying, if we're going to put the argument that it best serves those people who engage with it, we, I guess, need to ask the question, who are those people who are engaging with it, and why is it majority the same groups of people who are engaging with it? Because I guess even if we look at, I think everybody would, well, some people might agree that if we look at the government cabinet, for example, they're not necessarily a fair reflection of the country, the people that's in it. So I guess in terms of those people who have got access to or who engage with it, you can, I guess, even look at private schools play a big role in it. And I know, for example, it's not even necessarily a dig at private schools, but it's like if you go to private school, they teach you certain things about rhetoric, how the political system works, I didn't get taught that in a state school. So I guess it's, yes, it is those people who engage with it, but I guess it's also addressing why are certain people not engaging in it as much as others. And of course, then it kind of comes into like, well, do we need to kind of do something, I guess, in terms of, votes at 16, also education plays a role in it as well. And the whole thing about, for me, when I think of Britain and democracy, and I just think of the House of Lords, and I just think it's a laughing stock in all honesty. So I think that really, to kind of say Britain, we've got a strong democracy when we've got such an institution that has one, I just think this laughs in the face of it, to be honest. And of course, when we've got votes first past the post, which is another whole topic, which I'm sure we'll get into.
But I would say, if I may, just on those two of those points, which is private schools and the House of Lords, it looks to me like Labour will deal with that if they get in.
Well,
so
they say a lot of things, but we'll see what they do.
Well, I agree with you on Labour.
Yeah.
Well, democracy means power of the people, but with our current political infrastructure, I think that power is severely limited. Looking at the new voter ID laws, for example, these laws will essentially mean that people who can't afford to pay for photographic ID won't be able to vote, and therefore won't be able to engage in these systems at all. In England and national elections, our voting age remains 18, despite Scotland and Wales having a voting age of 16. I was writing laws before I was able to vote. I still haven't had the chance to vote. I turned 19 in July because we haven't had an election, but I've changed the law a lot of times. And I think that says quite a lot about not only how informed and educated young people can be now in the digital age, so meaning that we have the ability to change the law because of that knowledge, but also hopefully the ability to vote soon, or we should have the ability to vote because of that access to knowledge, but also about how who's getting a say. We're having Birmingham, for example, where I'm from, is the youngest city in Europe, yet the majority of those young people don't have a say at all because their MPs aren't going to reflect their views if they're not voting for them, and they can't vote for them because of the voting age, but also because young people are being increasingly disillusioned by politicians because of things like the university tuition fee increase, the massive A-level and GCSE disaster when I was doing my own GCSEs, and so many other things.
Scott, I mean, we're supposed to be sending people home feeling better about things. And you're just going to make them feel like a bunch of underachievers, to be perfectly frank. Going back to that 50% point, if 50% of people really feel that democracy and the exercising your right to vote isn't going to affect anything, but then by definition they must believe that the political system is never going to benefit them. So that is a long-term structural problem in terms of the health of democracy. So what can we do about it? What could be done? Or do you think nothing? I mean, we should also bear in mind that, of course, this isn't just a British phenomenon. There is disillusion with democracy across the West, and we all know what some of the results of that have been.
Well, I think the first thing that we should do is address the issue of trust in individual politicians, because we've had far too many cases in recent years of politicians, frankly, who've behaved abominably.
Tom, isn't that always going to happen? Like every political system
Well,
that's ever been.
it doesn't always have to happen. For instance, if you introduce a rule, which I think Labour are going to do, which we would support, of no second jobs for members of Parliament, so that people don't treat the role of being an MP as pin money while they're earning really all their money doing something that is not really related to working for their constituents. So that is something that needs to be addressed. We then need to address, for instance, the position of government ministers. How can anyone trust the government to deliver something when, for instance, since 2015, there have been, I think, 9 Secretaries of State for Education, and there have been 12 housing and planning ministers since 2015.
You weren't any of those, were you, Amber?
No, that wasn't.
Amber wasn't any. I deliberately made sure I didn't pick any of the roles that Amber had. But when we have a really serious housing crisis in the UK, where we need to provide homes for young people, that is not going to happen if you have 12 ministers in less than 10 years.
I completely agree with that. I completely agree the past few years have been chaotic, unstable, and no wonder the public trust has gone down. But I don't think that's been normal. I think it's been an abnormal time, and you're right, it hasn't just been in the UK. There's been sort of extraordinary churn in other democracies as well. And it may or may not settle down for a longer period, but I think everybody would say the sort of turnover of ministers has been undesirable. And I would also say, Lewis, that I served under David Cameron and then Theresa May, and it was under David Cameron and Theresa May, there was a much higher standard of expectation of behaviour amongst ministers and secretaries of state. And if you did something wrong, something, say, trivial, like bullying people, then you were out. And that wasn't the case under Boris Johnson, and I think that was part of the problem.
Such extraordinary high standards that were expected back then.
Yeah.
I guess, yes, in terms of integrity by politicians, I'd support any bill that I guess would stop them from having second jobs. But also, I guess, for me, it's just a whole, you can't even call an MP or even within House or if someone was to say, listen, the person's a liar, or you lied numerous times, you're not even able to kind of really kind of call them out. So I guess for me, it's when you also was talking about your stat about 50% of people, honestly, the amount of people I speak to within friends, even speaking to different councils, just different people, when they say a lot of people are completely disillusioned because they always, especially even in this current and next election, are forced to vote, in a lot of cases, vote for the lesser of two evils, as some people would put it, because they're stuck in terms of yes, and I might not vote for the Conservatives because of everything they've done, but the Labour Party are not necessarily putting any kind of policies forward. But I guess as long as we've got this first past the post system, which will always make it a two-horse race, and to be honest, none of the major political parties, Labour or the Conservatives, are willing to change it because it best serves them kind of thing. And that's why it was us and I think the Vatican State, who's the other country that has got first past the post.
Well, the papal conclave.
Yeah,
that is first past the post in a way.
It needs to change.
Yeah, I want to come back to the electoral.
Belarus also.
Good old Belarus.
Past the post, yeah.
Elections aren't very exciting in Minsk. I want to come back to the first past the post point because we've got to address it. But Scarlett, I hesitate to use you as a sort of token young person on the panel, but I suppose in a way you kind of forced into that position. Do you think that, isn't Amber's point fundamentally right, which is that we have got a politics, and I know this in terms of covering it, that consistently gears towards issues and issues that older people care about most. I mean, even today, what's the big story today? It's driving. And Sunak is prioritising driving and talking about the war on the motorist. Motorists, by definition, tend to be older and so on. And we see that in our politics again and again, housing and planning. Isn't the case that the truth is, though, is that young people have to take some responsibility for it because they don't vote or they don't vote as much?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think that the current chaos and overturn or upturn even of ministers that we're seeing might be new, but the systems that mean that's happening have always been there. For example, only Conservative members voted for our current Prime Minister. If you aren't a member of the Conservative Party, you did not have a say in who our Prime Minister is. That's not the first time that this happened, and that means that a significantly large proportion of people, or the majority, are not being heard. And then in terms of engagement with MPs, for example, the only time you can really do that is at a sort of constituency surgery. Lots of MPs don't do that, and there are actually a very large proportion of MPs who don't even show up to Westminster. So I don't think that this is particularly a young person issue, but rather how politicians are currently behaving, the code of conduct there, and also how engagement is limited, and how much our say over things is actually severely limited too. In terms of whether the government is pandering to older people rather than younger, I think that's certainly true. We know that the Conservative electorate is largely older. And I think Amber was actually saying today that only 1% of 18 to 25-year-olds are planning on voting Conservative. And I think that's because of how the Conservative government has consistently failed young people and consistently neglected us over the last, 13 years. Whether that's, university tuition fees, the A-level disaster, just completely neglecting the climate crisis despite failing all of our Paris Agreement targets and so much more. We're trying to be heard, we're talking to MPs, we're protesting, we're doing basically everything we can think of, but they're shutting us out.
But I would say you are being heard, because if the result is the Conservatives can see that only 1% are going to vote for the Conservatives, which is sort of...
That 1%.
I don't think they're in this room here today, Lewis. I feel certain. And I'm pretty sure that Scarlett's not in that group. But that is absolutely existential for the Conservative Party unless it turns it round. So in a way, that is democracy working, because it's showing that if you don't pay attention to this group, the young people, then you are not going to get their vote. And a vote is how democracy works.
We can't keep waiting 5 years for any change. We're running out of time here with the climate crisis. We have a cost of living crisis that's affecting students too. I've seen so many news reports recently about students who are homeless, who are sofa surfing and that sort of thing. I don't think it's right that students can only be heard every election. We need to be heard in the meantime too. And yet, all of these things about cost of living being out of control, the climate crisis, these issues are consistently ignored and not tackled.
But it feels that voice is being heard, I must say, and I'm not undermining it at all. I think it's incredibly important, because you read about it in the papers, and people like me have young people as children, and we mind about that as well. So I think it is. I understand your impatience with the electoral cycle, but I do feel that a democracy, you've got to have a one-person, one-vote system. Otherwise, what is it? Winston Churchill said, democracy is a terrible system, but better than all the others.
I just wanted to add that I think we do, all of us, people on the panel, but indeed the audience, have a responsibility to encourage everybody to register to vote and then to participate in that process. And currently, for instance, there are, apart from the 14,000 people who were turned away in the elections in England because they didn't have photographic voter ID, there are also 8 million people in the UK who are eligible to vote but not on the electoral register, and their voices are not being heard at all. I think we all have a responsibility to try to drive that process to get them registered.
But isn't that also part of the picture here, which is that in discussions like this, in all the endless column inches that were written about democracy dying or whatever it is, we always blame the politicians. Have not the public got some responsibility as well? I've voxed, as a TV journalist, enough people in different elections, gone up to them, how are you going to vote, how are you going to do this? There is a caustic cynicism, and not just a skepticism, which is perhaps appropriate, but a cynicism. I remember in the 2019 election, interviewing someone, and they said, oh, well, Jeremy Corbyn, Boris Johnson, they're both the same. I said, what? I said, you can have whatever view you want about either of them, but they are not the same. And that is not an especially uncommon view. There is just a kind of deep cynicism. And if that is what you choose to have, then don't be surprised if the political system lets you down, because there will be other people who choose to use it and inhabit it who will use it for interests other than yours.
Well, I wish people didn't have the degree of cynicism that they have about politicians generally, because in my experience, and I'm sure it's true for Magid and Amber and Scarlett, on the whole, people who are involved in politics are doing it because they want to make a difference. So I think we have to address perhaps the small number of politicians who don't give across that message, to boost the trust in politicians more generally, before we then look at some of the systems problems, like what Magid was saying around first past the post, which drives a political party, and this is clearest in relation to the positioning of the Conservative Party, to adopt quite extreme policies that are anti-woke, that are pro-car, pro-meat apparently, anti-car sharing, some really quite strange things. But they are appealing to a very small group, perhaps a third of the population, because they think they can get a majority under first past the post just if they get that third of people on side.
I keep trying to veer us away from it just because the words electoral reform don't usually ignite a discussion particularly, but maybe in this room it probably will. Let's address this now. Is the point, in terms of the answer to the question, who does our political system benefit? It benefits the Conservative and Labour parties. And in that sense, the House is sort of crooked in that way, because we know it doesn't benefit Labour that much, but it benefits them. They get to be second place, which in our system isn't exactly brilliant, but they get to be second place. Conservatives dominated 66 of 100 years of the 20th century, been in office 14 years, 13 years now. Is it just a cartel between the two of them?
Well, when Tom and I served in government together in a coalition, it didn't feel like that at all. I think
that went well for them, of course.
What?
It went well for them, of course.
Yes, it went less well for the Lib Dems, that is true. But as a form of government, I think it was incredibly effective, where it basically meant that you couldn't do the sort of extremes of your party, either if you were Lib Dem or if you were Conservative.
It's rare. We almost never have them.
I don't think it's a cartel, because the fact is that every political party, as we know, is cobbled together, hopefully, by a strong leader. But if you don't get a strong leader, what you get is incredible divisions within the party. So you have 3 or 4 parties within the party. So it doesn't feel like a cartel for me, because it feels like there are so many different interests within the political party that it's almost impossible to hold it together unless you've got strong leadership and strong articulation of what you're doing. And when it functions, the UK democracy, you've got a manifesto and you sit in cabinet and you deliver on your manifesto.
But Emma, isn't that the problem? I mean, you were forced in the Conservative Party to inhabit the same party as people, but let's be honest, if you were in a European democracy, you wouldn't have been in the same party. No way, you wouldn't have been with the same, would you be in the same party naturally with someone, I don't know, Lee Anderson? Or no, you wouldn't. And yet our system forces you, in the same way it does with the most Blairite of people, Blair himself, with Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes.
And that is just a recipe for instability,
yes, no, that is exactly what we've had. We've had the instability over the past few years, sort of triggered by the Brexit, but also by these issues of leadership and division within the parties. I remember when when I was at school many, many years ago, we used to say the reason we've got first past the post and not proportional representation is if you look over at Italy, they've got elections every 2 or 3 years. Isn't that ridiculous? Well, it's no longer quite so ridiculous, because it is made our system completely erratic by having elections every 2 or 3 years.
Would it be more democratic if we did have proportional representation?
Well,
it may not necessarily have the makeup or end result as many people would like, because yes, there may be some far right MPs that would get in, but would it be more democratic? Would it be a more fair system?
I think it could be more democratic, and I think that you could lance some of the tension that otherwise takes over political parties. So in the same way that the Labour Party was taken over by Jeremy Corbyn, should have been 2 parties.
Do you know, in terms of the cartel, the word that you chose, I can't help but think, for example, what's happening in the Labour Party at the moment. It does feel like if you don't necessarily get behind one view, you will be sidelined.
Well, it's very factional.
Completely factional, and you can say, how do you win? How do you end factionalism? You win. For example, Boris Johnson would get rid of Churchill's grandson and so many other people just because. And some people say, do you know what? That's strong leadership. You kind of get it done, but it's at the same time, like you said, a lot of people within the Labour Party. It's a broad spectrum, and I think having just 2-party system doesn't allow much ideas to come through.
I can't imagine what a Lib Dem thinks about this question.
Well, the great news, of course, is that within the Labour Party, 83% of party members support proportional representation, and so does the trade union movement. Currently, it's just the leadership that doesn't support it. But I think what proportional representation does, and I haven't really heard anyone be able to demolish this argument, what is wrong with when people vote in the country as a whole, those voters getting represented in Parliament the right proportion of MPs from for the parties they've just voted for. I think that is the fundamental principle about proportional representation. It is the fairest way of reflecting voters' views in Parliament. What it would also facilitate, I think, is the sort of dialogue we're having here. So now I'm sure there'll be some flashpoints between the different people on the panel, but broadly speaking, I think former Liberal Democrat, former Green, elected former Green, former Conservative, and I don't know what Scarlett's party position is, but we can have a dialogue, and I think a PR system can do that much more effectively than a first-past-the-post system, which tends to have a swing of the pendulum one way, with Rishi Sunak appealing to that really small core of quite sort of fundamentalist conservatives, and then potentially a swing the other way. So that's one of the reasons why, or another reason why, I support PR, and I'm very pleased that an overwhelming majority of Labour Party members support it as well.
The opposition used to be to proportional representation is that it doesn't deliver the stability of first past the post, and that has been blown apart by the past few years.
Scarlett, does it excite you, PR?
Does it excite me? Ooh.
It's not a question.
word.
It's not a question you hear every day, is it?
I think that most people right now just want to find, like, when they think of voting, they want to vote for the party that is going to actually improve their quality of life. In real terms, most people's lives haven't improved over the last 13 or so years. Like, junior doctors are on strike right now. The trains are on strike, as we all probably here have experienced. Poverty is at an absolute high. Homelessness is at an absolute high. And that hasn't changed despite the, 4 prime ministers we've had since this government was first put in place.
5, actually. It's
5.
easy to forget.
Ooh, thank you.
A lady
See?
called Liz Truss.
This enormous
you remember her.
upturn, despite all of these prime ministers having very different promises and pledges, the actual reality has only worsened. I think if we had proportional representation, then there would perhaps be a chance for people to actually vote for people who they think have their interests at heart, rather than a more codified national thing, or a more personalised approach.
Every one of those prime ministers will have thought that they had the answer to giving a better quality of life for people. Every one of them will have thought they could deliver.
I don't know if that's necessarily true. If we look at Liz Truss, under her very brief, tenure, fossil fuel companies had record high profits, whilst families across the UK hit record high levels of poverty. She would have known. When she did all of the things she did to put us in that position, she knew what she was doing.
But if she were here, she would say that she created a very generous energy package which supported
and I can
families
say
across the
that
country.
I'm the president of the US, but it doesn't make it true.
But in fairness to her, and I say I didn't expect to be in a position of defending Liz Truss today, but in fairness to her, it was true. She did put an energy package in place which supported people. And maybe it wasn't enough, and she obviously wasn't there for very long, but she did do that. Moving on, when we were talking about, moving on. She's not here, by the way, don't worry. She isn't our special guest. Going back to the point of the parties and the current system benefiting the parties, is one of the other ways that there is a problem with our political system, and in the sense that these are 2 parties which are very closed, where it is not easy for people to know if they are, as I was saying, irritated by the system and want to change it, and then they think, well, I want to be an MP. It isn't necessarily very easy for them to do so, is it? Particularly because of the factionalism that we were just discussing. To take the Labour Party as an example, which is probably the worst example of it, you can have all the good ideas you like, but if you're not in with the current leadership, if you're not in with the right trade union movement, if you're not in with the right affiliate organisation, in fact, you probably have to be all 3, you haven't got a hope in hell of getting a seat.
Yeah, it's really, I'm not in the Labour Party, but I know enough friends that have kind of struggled, and a lot of people who are really talented people, so in some sense it kind of does create a vacuum, but it's just, it's really, really unfortunate. I think one of the other things I think really could benefit the political party system is having an open selection, which they'll have in the States, whereas basically if you're a sitting MP, it doesn't necessarily guarantee you that to become the next candidate at the next election. Because at the moment we've got, if you're an MP, people might not necessarily want you to, in terms of, are fond of you, or you can't get challenged, basically. You can't get challenged within your own party if somebody else has got better ideas. Because one of the things is, if someone comes to me and says, Magid, how can I become an MP? How can I become a council? It's like you said, it's not as easy as, well, if you do this and that, you'll become an MP, or it's done on merit alone. It really, really isn't. It is this massive maze, but it does kind of just, again, it's very slippery, and it just makes it really difficult for, I guess, to open it up so people do feel like they can engage in the political system.
I think one of the big problems, the sort of modern problem, is the size of political parties, because they are now so small that actually the pool of candidates from whom the parties are drawing is much smaller. So I think there's a big challenge for all of the political parties about how do you broaden that base and get a wider cross-section of people in so that when you're making those critical decisions about who is going to be the next candidate for a particular seat, that you've got a far wider range of people coming forward?
Tom is right, and also, each political party, I imagine, but I can speak for the Conservative Party, when you go in front of an association and try and get selected to be their candidate, to be the next Member of Parliament, there's always one question or two that basically decide whether they think you're one of them. And the current one now is about Brexit. And so I would not get selected now because I still think that Brexit is bad for the country, but it's very difficult for candidates to be in front of a Conservative association and say that. They all have to be pro-Brexit.
Do you think having a maximum term limit would be good?
I worry that you'd have something else which you'd put MPs off from people becoming MPs. I mean, becoming an MP is a commitment to a way of life which is just full on all the time, and it's putting yourself up for a lot of abuse, and it's totally takes your mind from off anything else, and your family get involved, and basically there are so many reasons not to become an MP. I mean, when I became an MP, everyone said to me, "What are you doing?"
You know, sometimes it's the language of entitlement, because some people will be like, well, no, you'll see some people, even MPs, that would say, well, I'm going to be losing my job, which is, I guess, you're going to be losing their job, but they'll kind of use as if, like, they're entitled to a job. No, it's an actual privilege to be an elected representative, and just because you have got that, it doesn't mean that you're entitled to kind of be a long life MP, unless people kind of vote you for that, but it's just having that different mind frame.
Scarlett?
I do actually think that's a really good point. There seems to be a lot of MPs who feel as if becoming an MP is their God-given right from the day they got their Oxford PP acceptance letter. And I think that's a precedent that really needs to be dismantled. I think MPs should represent the electorate, and that means most of the time they should have had a life before they become an MP. It shouldn't be...
But that would mean far fewer younger MPs.
Yeah, and I definitely have no intention of going into politics.
It wasn't really a question, but okay.
Just,
you ruled it out now.
But I think MPs should have been former doctors, lawyers, nurses. I've forgotten every job that exists now, but the things that you guys all do, so that they can actually represent interests that are outside of their tutorials and lectures. And I don't think that the current selection process is, conductive for that or conducive, because you have to. It's about who you know, not necessarily what you know, and what experiences you've had, and I think that's quite wrong.
One of the ways historically in which we've tried to, particularly after moments of crisis, to reinvigorate the political system has been to expand the franchise. It happened in the 19th century with more and more men, early 20th century with women, equalisation with women and men eventually, and working class men as well. Obviously, we haven't had a franchise extension since the 70s when the age was reduced from 21 to 18. Labour Party is committed to votes for 16-year-olds. Might that inject some energy into the system and redress some of those age problems that we've been talking about?
I think that it certainly would. We've seen in Scotland and Wales that this has significantly increased voter turnout. It's engaged young people more. We're in this digital age where there's far more access to information. And also the younger generation, I would say, are better at being able to tell what is fake news and what isn't, unlike the older generation. So perhaps we're even more informed because we can eliminate the things that are just blatantly lies. At 16, we're also paying tax. We have so many more rights. I moved out at 17, so before I could vote, but I was a fully functional adult by then, despite not actually being 18. And writing laws, I should have been able to vote. I think that lowering the voting age is kind of an essential step going forward. We've always updated the franchise as we've evolved, as we've seen with the Suffrage Act, being extended again and again. We should continue with that tradition and extend democracy so that it truly is the power of the people and not the power of the people that the government like.
We
could extend it to EU citizens, of course, as well, people with settled status.
Indeed, and that is one of the things that Labour are also proposing. Unlock Democracy, we support the extension of votes at 16, and the evidence from Scotland is that young people voted, greater number of 16 and 17-year-olds voted in the Scottish referendum than the older age groups, the 18 to 24s or 18 to 25, so they were active participants, and of course, they would have had education at school, civic education at that time, so they were perhaps better prepared. But there is likely, if Labour get elected, to be an extension to give the vote to long-term residents in the UK who are not currently eligible to vote. And again, that's something that we support. If people have been long-term resident here, they're using local services, why wouldn't they have a vote? And the other thing that is definitely happening, and will be happening from January onwards, is that every single UK citizen who lives abroad and who's lived abroad for more than 15 years will now be able to vote, because that is an extension to the franchise that has already been voted through.
So we're going to have people who are settled here who don't have any right to vote.
Correct, and people who are settled in Thailand 40 years who will.
That sounds optimal. Magid?
Not much there.
One other thing that I wanted to talk about is the relationship in our political system between power at the centre and power everywhere else. I mean, we're sat in Leeds, which is I'm told, the biggest city in Europe not to have a local transport system outside of cars and buses, trains, rail, etc. You will all struggle here, like we did, to get here today. You all very bravely did so anyway. We're very grateful. Otherwise, we'd just be talking to ourselves, which wouldn't be the first time that a political panel like this had happened. But there is no doubt in my mind that if places like Leeds had more power and more money and more ability to raise their own money, that would not be the case. That they would have a local transport system that was worth something, and they wouldn't be struggling against, having that absurdity of the system that they have now. So is there an argument around that we've been having for years now around localism and decentralisation? Is any politician actually going to take it seriously?
But I think that we have done in the past, but different leaders have pushed the button further on it or pulled it away. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think we definitely should have more devolution to cities. And I think that the devolved city mayors are doing generally a great job. And I think the ability that people have on their phones to see what's going on, to be much more in touch with everyday actions from politicians locally will help to support that. So I think it's definitely something which politicians should do more of, to make people feel more in touch and to be part of a kind of devolved future, Magid had.
But Rishi Sunak today, I mean,
he's wrong.
I know you're going to say, but he's given an interview today, which is the perfect embodiment of the problem, right? He's come along and said, sort of Cohen's hotline style, he's come along and said, well, we're going to stop. His wording was really interesting. He said, we are going to stop 20-mile-per-hour zones being imposed on people locally. Now, impose is a fascinating way of conceiving of local decisions taken by locally elected democratic representatives. And actually, the real imposition is come from Whitehall, because that will be Whitehall saying, no, you can't do that. But that speaks to the problem of the system, right?
A recent poll in Wales confirms that the Welsh actually favour 20-mile-per-hour zones. So what he's advocating is an increased likelihood of people being hit by a car and dying. Now, that's quite a strange political stance for him to adopt.
Depends how they vote, I suppose.
His interference with things like how many times a month or a week people's bins are collected, well, that's not really a role for a prime minister. We need more devolution. I think what we need to see is a system where it is the local authorities that can say, we think we can take control of transport, we think we can take control of the skills agenda, we think we can take control of the job centres because we have the expertise and the local knowledge. That would be of benefit to the UK, which out of all of the OECD countries, so developed countries in the world, is, I think, the most centralised. In other words, Westminster has more power over what happens locally in the UK than virtually any other developed country in the world.
And democracy works for those who are engaged with it. And so if you have more devolved, you allow people to get more engaged with it, democracy functions better.
Do you know, I think one of the things that Rishi kind of thinks what happened in Uxbridge is going to happen around the country, which is not necessarily true. But I guess, honestly, even to take it one step further, I don't see why, in a place like Yorkshire, in my opinion, why we couldn't even have something like a Yorkshire Assembly. And I know GDP is not necessarily the best way to measure progress, but if we look at, for example, GDP of Wales compared to Yorkshire, Yorkshire nearly doubles it. And I just think in terms of really bringing local decisions being done by local people and actually empowering the electorate to actually get involved in democracy, I think having something such as a bigger assemblies in different parts of regions, which necessarily could even just rival the South in terms of bringing resources, generating its own income as well, I think would be really powerful.
Scarlett, you were shaking your head when Amber was saying that the mayors are doing a great job.
So I'm from Birmingham. I've lost the accent, but I promise I'm actually from there. And our Metro Mayor of the West Midlands has done essentially nothing. Like, you know, in the last few years, we've had the bin strikes, which resulted in 4-foot rats. Did we have anything from the West Midlands Mayor? No. HS2 is a disaster right now, despite the fact that outside of Birmingham, there's essentially no public transport. Even getting from Solihull to Birmingham, which is probably like a 20-minute drive, is essentially impossible because of the lack of public transport infrastructure, because the lack of involvement from our West Midlands Mayor. Our city council has just gone bankrupt, which means that even engaging with the council is going to be super difficult. And the decisions that the council can take out themselves are going to be severely limited because they've gone bankrupt. I think we definitely need more devolution, but we also need to ensure that councils and metro mayoral authorities are given the resources to actually be able to enact change, and are also they need to have more accountability. So if a Prime Minister does something wrong, it's going to be in the news. The same with MPs. Usually the metro mayors can get away with stuff because people aren't as engaged with local issues because of this focus we have on Westminster. I think we kind of nationally need to take a focus a little bit away from Westminster and back into the regions outside of London.
I'm all for more accountability at a local level. So I think that's absolutely right. And the more we can do to make people feel that they can see more and that everything's more transparent, I think the stronger our democracy will be. So I certainly agree with that.
But I think the reason why there is this focus on Westminster is because Westminster controls so much of what happens in local authority areas.
And that needs to change. We need devolution.
When we have the Prime Minister trying to set the cycle for the frequency of bin collections, then you can see that degree of control is intolerable. These are decisions that should be made locally, where people can hold their locally elected officials to account. The locally elected officials raise money, they then spend it on services, and if they do a good job, they get re-elected, and if they don't, they get replaced by someone who might do a better job.
Yeah, we saw in the COVID period the weakness of that model, because you had the absurdity of Whitehall basically setting policy and sending messages to every school in England and telling them exactly how to behave in this way, and there was nothing beyond the council between the government for most of England, unlike Scotland and Wales. But just go back, running out of time before questions, to go back to that question talking about Brexit that I supposed at the beginning, which is we have had this deeply political period. One of the things, whether you're for Brexit or against it, it could have been a moment of political renewal for Britain. It could have been a moment where politicians thought really deeply about how we're governed. It became such cliche to say, that people are voting against this idea of being left behind, that there has to be a reckoning in some way. That really hasn't happened in any way, has it? There hasn't been any really deep thought about how we're governed and what our political system could do better. We've just left the EU and moved on. Why is that?
I think that, we should have done all that thinking before the vote, perhaps.
That might have been an idea. Do you still speak much to David Cameron, Amber? Or?
Given moving swiftly on, given that we didn't, I think that it was just a very difficult, chaotic period where nobody could resolve the best way to leave the EU. It was just unprecedented in its own way. I think the lesson is that people always think that referendums are going to settle something, and in fact they have exactly the opposite effect. And it was the same with the Scottish referendum in 2014. The idea was that it would settle it. It absolutely didn't. It energised the SNP. And the same thing is with the EU referendum. It has completely led to chaos, I think, in the political system in the UK. And then the Conservative Party, for instance, in 2016, 42% of Conservatives, like myself, voted to remain. And after that, because Boris Johnson made the Conservative the Brexit Party, they all left. And now the Conservative Party got very few people who are former Remainers because it's become so much more central to it. It actually has caused this realignment.
I think one thing that if we ever get to discuss such a similarly complex issue again, including, for instance, the question of whether we should rejoin the European Union, which I would favour, then what we should do in advance of that process is have something, a citizens' assembly. Now, some in the audience may be familiar with these, others not. So a citizens' assembly, the concept is that you get together a group of people, perhaps 200 people, who are a representative sample of the UK population as a whole, and they are chosen using a sort of scientific methodology to ensure that is the case. So they are age, gender, income balanced. And you put the question to them, you provide them with experts who can argue the case from either side, and they deliberate, and they then come forward with recommendations. These have worked very well in places like the Republic of Ireland, where they were tasked with looking at abortion laws, and they were also tasked at looking at the question of equal marriage, and came forward with policy proposals that, frankly, the politicians would never have dared articulate, but they have, in fact, adopted those, and those are working very effectively.
So I just want to end on a quick fire. No, I've got no time for that. I want to end on a...
The Lib Dem.
Yes, one Lib Dem. Quick fire. Before we go to questions, if you could change one thing about our political system to make it better, Magic Wand style, territory, what would you do?
PR.
PR. I knew a Lib Dem would say
Yeah,
that. Right?
but also PR with education.
PR with education. PR education with...
Totally reform the House of Lords. I find it an embarrassment.
Abolish it?
No, you need a second chamber, but I'd
Elected
totally
chamber.
Elected chamber.
Finally, Scarlett.
Lower the voting age.
Sorry, say that again?
Lower the voting age.
Lower the voting age. That's not a bad little manifesto. Some party should put that together, shouldn't they? Give them a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Well, that was absolutely fascinating. It's time to bring you all into the conversation as well. So I'll take questions in groups of three. We have got these rather funky, very unusual microphones, which look like sort of, they're being held up now. They're sort of cube-shaped, and we're told you can throw them at each other if you're particularly angered by what someone has said, so you can do that. So let's start down here with the blue mic, shall we? And go to this lady at the front there, and then over here as well. And I'll work our way around the room, so don't worry. And then gentlemen at the back there, you can fight over it potentially. Let's start down here.
Thank you. I'm here with my dad, actually, and we're both, like, really wanting to ask a question. And I just said to him, well, we can't both put our hands up because they'll pick you. and then I realised that's the whole point. Everyone is afraid of the culture of entitlement and the culture of who gets a voice and who is listened to. It is so much more frightening to try and speak out when you don't look like the people who have the power. And I'm from Leeds, I grew up here, but I don't have a very strong Leeds accent. Both my parents went to uni. Like, it is much easier for me than someone else to speak up and ask a question. And what I find really interesting about watching your panel discussion is the lack of interest in culture and ideas around what makes our system the system it is. You're all talking about strategies and about like specific things that you can do like PR. But what about the culture of the system? What about the fact that every single time Lewis asked a question, I'm going to be critical now.
Oh, great.
Sorry, not sorry. Amber and Tom, you were so much more confident to assume that that question is directed at you and that you have the voice to answer that question first. When clearly the majority of people in the room want to hear what Scarlett has to say. Right, so this is the difficulty with the discourse. And I will have to stop myself because I'll go on and on. Okay. Because there is a question here. But it is so enraging to see the lack of discussion about the culture of our system. And the culture of our system is that people want to be heard. Everybody wants to be heard. Amber and Tom have been in government, so they're used to being heard. So the question is, are people in power prepared to amplify the voices of people who do not have as much power and step back?
Okay, grateful for you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm worried you might throw that over in this direction. Let's go to this person here, since the microphone is close. That's it. Give it a good... Wow, very good. Well done.
I just wanted to, similar to that point, I just wanted to ask, currently our political system is depriving the rights of some people. It's not benefiting them, it's not neutral, it's depriving the rights of those people. How do you think we shift it so that, as a starting point, they're not being deprived of their rights, and then they start to benefit from the political system? Because there's some people who I don't think it's neutral for, it's taking away their rights.
And who in particular have you got in mind?
I think especially this week, refugees and asylum seekers. I think especially in the media recently, trans rights. I think they are massive, massive issues. I think there's so many other marginalised groups, disabled people. But yeah.
Okay. Let's take one from up here. What about the gentleman there, directly in front? You might, yeah, okay, give it a go. I'm not sure. Ooh. Ah, yeah. I'm beginning to see a flaw in this plan. There we go. There we go.
Yeah. Hi. Right at the beginning, you were talking about whether democracy is the best system. You said, well, it's the least worst. That was a sort of introductory discussion. And what hasn't been mentioned is how, it's more like a philosophical question, really, how 50% plus one is the best way of making decisions that's best for everybody. So I think obviously the Brexit result was a great illustration of how not to build a consensus for a decision that the majority benefit from, or is a fair decision. So how do you make a fair decision with 50% plus one? That includes in Parliament, but also as an electoral system as well.
Okay. So three quite different questions there. I suppose we should address the elephant in the room now, which I suppose is on me as much as anyone else. Amber, Tom, do you think that when you were politicians, you didn't amplify the voices enough of those who weren't able to have their own?
What do you think, Scarlett?
Okay, so, as someone who's starting university this year, there's a few grievances here with the university tuition fees tripling under the coalition government. That has fundamentally ruined, the prospects of going to university for so many people my age. I know that there's loans that you only have to pay every month, and it's like the same as your phone bill or whatever, but the amount of people I know my age who haven't gone to university despite getting amazing A-level results because of the cost is ridiculous, and I don't think that in an economy as big as ours, people shouldn't be going to university because they can't afford it. And that's the same with so many other things. I keep talking about the cost of living crisis. It's terrible. It's the result of conservative austerity that the Liberal Democrats helped. It's frankly disgraceful for the sixth largest economy in the world to have record high levels of poverty that is just honestly incomprehensible given the state of our economy. It's incomprehensible how much we're failing all of our climate targets despite being such a large economy, and how much we keep neglecting those who are the most vulnerable. One of the people asking questions spoke about refugees right now. The way that we're treating refugees is so terrible. These are people who have fled, incredible, in a bad way, conflict, have seen just absolutely inhumane things, and instead of giving them a place to live, we're turning them away, or we're making weird claims like Suella Braverman earlier this week, talking about people pretending to be LGBTQ+, to seek asylum. It's just like the government right now feels completely out of touch with the people that it claims to represent, and I don't think that's a particularly new thing. I think that they're following a precedent that has been set many, many years ago.
I guess, just kind of following up from that, and I guess in terms of giving people more space, and in terms of, I guess, representation, one thing that really pisses me off, in all honesty, is when people say, well, Magid, look at the Conservative government, they're so diverse, kind of thing, as if, trickle-down identity politics is going to solve, all our problems. Honestly, Suella Braverman, they don't necessarily represent all of brown or black people, ethnic minorities kind of views. So I literally, I would rather much prefer an old white man that stands up for the rights of migrants, refugees, just stands up for, in terms of, I guess, my values and principles, rather than somebody that just happens to look like me, but is kind of on the opposite side.
I suppose what people mean when they say that, you're right, it's often used as if it's sort of the answer to everything, but I suppose what people mean when they say that is a bit like when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. Lots of people would say that she did very little for women, but the very fact that she was there showed that it could be done, and that was valuable as well.
value to certain people. I wouldn't necessarily say it was valuable.
I mean, they're all from a very...
Valuable to women.
Well, not all women.
Yes, I've met plenty of women who went into politics. They may not have hated Margaret Thatcher, they may have loved her, but the fact that she was a woman and became a prime minister matters.
But she had to change so much about herself too. I don't like Thatcher, to clarify. But, you know, she, like how she adopted a new voice so that was deeper, so she could blend in with men. All of these trade-offs that she had to make so that she could assimilate. You know, it shows that despite her being a woman and being in this amazing position, her being a woman still held so many barriers that weren't dismantled during her premiership. And she could have gone some way to help do that, but I don't think she did as much as she could.
Briefly, please, because we want to get to other questions.
Well, can I come in last, just to say that in relation to citizens' assemblies, that is the exact purpose of citizens' assemblies. And there are people who advocate, and I would support this, the idea of having a fourth estate. Now, normally the fourth estate is the media, but in this context, the fourth estate, so you have the executive, so the government, you have the legislature, parliament, and then you would have the judiciary, and then you would have a citizens' assembly. And the purpose of the citizens' assembly, which, as I said earlier, is a genuinely representative body so that all of the voices are heard, including those that are normally excluded from these processes, are there, and it is tasked to consider these issues and to feed into the parliamentary and government process. And I think that is an effective way. And what it does is, it's about ensuring that there is public judgment on an issue, rather than, I think the gentleman higher up was making this point, rather than public opinion. So you get informed judgment, you don't get a spur of the moment, I think it's that, and you end up with a 50% plus one and a decision that in relation to Brexit has been pretty catastrophic.
So I'm sure that if the system is working properly, that should be Parliament, shouldn't it? If Parliament is working properly, then it will represent people properly, and they won't need this group of people that no one's ever heard of to feed into the debate.
Well, I think the difficulty that, I mean, most members of Parliament, certainly was the case for me, and I'm sure for Amber, so I lived in my still live in my constituency, so I was in touch with people virtually almost every hour of the day, including doing the shopping in Sainsbury's was a bit of a challenge, because if I went in for 5 items, I would have 5 conversations before I left the supermarket. So you do hear views, but there are a significant percentage of people who have no interaction at all. And maybe it's the 8 million people that I talked about who are not on the register at all, and the Citizens' Assembly identifies those people and makes sure that they are part of the process.
Let's take some questions from this corner of the room with the pink microphone. Shall we? Let's start up there. Gentleman who's got his hand up there.
So I think my question is about education. How do we change the education system? You've spoken so much about engaging younger voters and younger people. In school, we're taught nothing about those sorts of things like tax and pensions and all these things that ultimately government actually affect. I think most people, when you get out of school, you reach 18, 19, you pay tax, you go, I don't know what this is. What's this paying into? Like the education in the education system, is there any suggestions from you guys as to how we, in a non-partisan way, educate people about this is what politics are actually doing. This is what the council does. This is what council tax pays for, rather than us as citizens getting out there and being totally disengaged as the money's coming out of our bank accounts and as we're making these political decisions. Like, what are they actually doing?
Let's bring the microphone down here. Lady here. Just down here. He's got a hand up. Talk amongst yourselves.
So thanks for this afternoon. It's been interesting hearing different views.
Could you just say your name, by the way? I should have asked everybody else.
Sorry, my name is Julie.
Julie.
it has been interesting, but it is still quite bleak, isn't it? And I just wondered if the panel had any thoughts about hope, because I think we need to restore hope within the system. How do we get, I think the fish rots from the head, and we've seen numerous examples of that over recent years. Scarlett, your declaration of not wanting to go into politics did sniff out some hope, because I think you're an incredible young woman, and whatever has ignited your interest in politics and your proactivity in it needs to be bottled and shared across the nation, across the world really. But I just think, how can we get hope to get the right people in to put themselves forward? And yes, there are massive sacrifices involved, but the right people involved to bring about the change. I think we all agree here that change is needed. And secondly, the hope to instill in the population to engage in the process, to feel that they can be heard and seen, and their needs taken account of. Because the political instability that we've had, the impact on climate change, social care, health and education, the damage is going to be felt for generations, because we're flip-flopping between different policies just for sound bites and popularity, and something needs to change. So anything to go home with a bit of hope, because if we lose hope, then, what's the point?
I was hoping not to depress everything. We've got a couple of questions down here. Sorry, just got a couple of questions down here. Let's do them since they're so close to each other. We're not going to risk anyone's injury. Just say your name, please.
Leanne, I love how this is not being thrown despite being designed for that. That's interesting. That's not my question. At LIFI last year, we had Christopher Wiley talking about everything that led to completely destabilising our system of democracy, leading to the Brexit vote, and how our country became so divided, and true for other superpowers like the US as well. My question is, given that since then, human rights are being rolled back, the right to protest, for example, anybody who is politically engaged, anybody who does feel strongly and wants to take action, their ability to do that and speak their truth and try and impact change is being taken away from them. And this is not something that's been touched upon this evening. So, this afternoon. I'm curious how you all feel about that.
Okay. And then finally, let's do one more since we're in that vicinity.
Hi, I'm Laura. I've got a comment and a question. So my first comment was just, there was some discussion about whether the public have a responsibility to engage, but I don't think we can rely on the public to make the first move in a system that's become so full of cynicism. People are living with incredible barriers in their everyday lives just to survive in many cases. And if we look around at other areas of our lives, we have instantaneous access to express ourselves on social media now. We feel incredibly empowered as consumers in many places. So I think sometimes the political system is an area of our lives that feels incredibly hard to enter into or even to touch. So I think our politics has to make the first move rather than expecting the general populace to come to it. My question was, we focused a lot on Parliament, and I guess my question was, how much of this do you think is about the kind of technical elements of our wider policy-making process? There are lots of things about our policy-making process that are really hard to engage with and aren't meaningful. We have guidance around consultation process, but they're guidance. There's no requirement for government departments to follow best practice on consultations, and there's still, even best practice is still very hard for most people to engage with it, even to know consultations are happening. There's a requirement to publish an equality impact assessment of policy, but those assessments don't have to lead to anything. They don't have to necessarily mean that you have to change policy, and we don't have a very diverse civil service either. So I just wonder whether you have any thoughts about the broader policy-making process and what we need to do to broaden participation there.
Thank you so much, Laura. Should we just start, if anyone has any thoughts on Julia's question, because it's the biggest in a sense. I mean, how do we get hope? And how hopeful, to evolve it slightly, how hopeful are you all about our politics in the future?
I think we've got no opportunity, we've got no choice but to feel hopeful. And for me, I always have to kind of remind myself and others that, a lot of the problems that we face, climate crisis, and all the problems, they didn't necessarily just come down from the heavens. They were made by man-made decisions. You can argue mainly by men in suits. But fundamentally, they are bad human decisions. And I think so just realizing the fact that, we as people can actually really impact and actually have make some sort of difference, and it's not necessarily just, obviously I think it's really important to constantly remind people. And I guess in terms of just coming to the education question, naturally, I guess PSHE, I don't know if it still continues, something within that realm kind of makes sense. And for me, it's not necessarily just, I guess, telling people, of course it is important about how to finance your money, how taxes, all that kind of works. But for me, it's more so really just empowering people to know how they can actually change things if they don't like how things are basically being done. So engaging, teaching them in terms of how you can get involved or how change is made. All those things are really, really fundamental. And I guess in terms of the comment, the last person, yes, it's not necessarily just good enough, I guess, having a political system like voting and be like, well, yeah, people just need to engage with it kind of thing. I think there's a lot of work that needs to kind of go around that. Even if it's literally simple things like changing the voting day. For some reason, I'm sure you probably know why we vote on a Thursday, and every single election is probably to do something with like drinking or something like that. But honestly, like in other parts of Europe, they vote on a Sunday and it's a public holiday, just to kind of, again, make it easier for people to actually engage with the voting process.
I think that's to do with, sorry, I feel so careful now about not speaking. I'm going to wait till you say Anne.
Right, okay. Scarlett, since you wanted to go.
I think that there is hope around. It's not necessarily in the UK, perhaps, but in other countries. If we look at Ecuador this August, they voted to stop all oil drilling in the Usani, which accounts for 12% of their total oil exports. And 60% of voters voted to stop that oil drilling, and it was the largest election turnout they've had in years. I think that's amazing. In Colombia, for example, they've just had, this eco-president after 450 years of basically right-wing dictators. Even closer to us in Europe, Germany have rolled out this new really cheap rail ticket. I think it's 30 euros a month. So public transport has massively had an increase in uptake. Carbon emissions have lowered because people have functional, cheap public transport that they can use. In Italy, they've adapted more climate education. More young people learning about climate education and therefore can make more informed decisions when it comes to their own futures. And also, the government is taking out actions to actually decarbonise that education space too. There are good things happening everywhere. In the UK too, the Rosebank oil field was approved this week, which I think is terrible news. I know not everyone will agree with me here, but a lot of their funders have been backing out because even they don't see it as economically feasible. They don't see drilling for oil in time of climate crisis as economically feasible. And I think that's a sign of change, and I think that's amazing and good. And I also just don't think we have the option to stop hoping, no matter how ridiculous it might seem at times, because then the people who are causing this lack of hope just get to do what they want to completely unobstructed. And I don't think that's a position we can afford to be in. I don't think that's a position we would survive in. Lots of people in their questions have spoken about how lots of demographics are being systematically excluded from politics, and if those demographics completely, stop hope or stop pretending to hope, then they're going to be even more excluded, if that's even feasible given how bad it is right now. So it's a matter of survival. We don't really get to choose this. And even on that note too, I think we have some privilege here, being a democracy, being a large economy. When it comes to things like the climate crisis, for example, it's not affecting us to the same scale as it is in other countries every single day. So we can actually, engage with it in a slightly more leisurely fashion than people who are actually being, kicked out of their homes because of floods and are literally just fighting to survive can. I think we need to acknowledge that space that we have almost to be able to take action and really use it.
And to take Laura's question, she was talking about consultations and the way government interacts with people when it's policy making, and she mentioned equality impact assessments. And obviously, there's a different way of looking at the question we've been looking at, which is, who does our political system benefit? Well, it tends to benefit people with most power, and historically, and even now, that will be white people, and it will be rich people, and it will be men. And that's one of the few things that has been introduced to try and at least show the impact of what is happening on government policy. But there's been such a backlash of looking at that question in that way in recent years, hasn't there? I mean, I noticed the other day where the Sun newspaper took the equality impact assessment that HS2 had done and labelled it a woke train line, which I'm not entirely sure how you can have a woke train line, but there you go. Do you think that, I mean, is that sort of part of the prism through which we should be looking at these questions?
I don't think that's not really the politicians. That's the whole environment in which politicians are trying to operate, where the polarization, because of, I think it's, not entirely, but partially to do with social media, polarizing people into their corners and really becoming very angry with each other.
Do you not think that they're interdependent? Like, for example, with trans issues, the proportion of trans people in the UK is probably less than 1%, yet every single day, perhaps, we see government ministers and newspapers talking about trans people as if it's a far bigger issue.
It's difficult to judge that, because I can tell you as a former MP, you get people coming to see you and lobbying you on things, and that might be what MPs are responding to. I don't know, not having been one since 2019. But I do think that the period between 2015 and 19 was a shaming period, really, to have been a member of parliament and part of a government, because everything felt so difficult to deliver on, and the big issue of Brexit, which the public had voted for, was so destructive and difficult to deliver on, and therefore to get other stuff. So I actually think that government became quite poor during that period on many different levels, because it sucked the energy out of everything else that people were trying to do. But in terms of hope, if I may, I think that Parliament really matters, and it is the centre of our legislation, etc. I do go around a lot of schools and colleges and talk to people, and I particularly try to encourage young women to consider standing for Parliament. I'll see you later, Scarlett. There are people who will do it, even though it is such a challenge. And I can see, I have a friend whose son is going to be standing amazingly as a Labour MP, and I know someone standing as a Conservative. There are some great people coming in. And I think that's what I'm hopeful for. Even though it is a really difficult job and it's full of reasons not to do it, there are still some great people on both the main parties, and I'm sure it's the same for the Lib Dems, who are setting their hearts into doing this, and they're doing it for the right reasons. So I'm hopeful that that will lead to a positive government in the future.
We're running out of time rapidly, so I want to bring you this side of the room in with these mics up here. So anyone down here with the green mic, I think it is. Let's go here first. Yeah. And if we could make them reasonably rapid, please, because we are running out of time. Can we hear you? Try again.
Try again? There we go. Thank you. My name's Jamie. Thank you. I'll try and keep it brief. Just reflecting on some of the previous questions and answers, and also the title of the session today, it seems to me that the system benefits the venal and the incompetent. It's those that get bedded in. It's just, that's my own view. Amber says it's a job not many want, but we seem to have a club that creates clones. And the problem with clones is you actually get mutations, that sort of thing. You end up with people that are poor communicators. Some of them are out of touch. Certainly some are completely unfit for purpose. I think 5 years, going back to what Scarlett said, is far too long to hold people's feet to the fire. Why don't we have systems, certainly in my job, and I know pretty much everybody else here, you will get reviewed at least yearly, if not daily, depending on the industry you're in. And yet we have systems where people get away with saying complete nonsense. They can lie, they can take money from other jobs. There is no quality control here. Why do we not have better systems to hold politicians to task and make sure they do a decent job?
Thank you very much. And then the person in front of you, just directly there. Yeah.
Hi there. So I have a bit of a point of information.
What's your name, sorry?
Question. It's Jess.
Jess, hi Jess.
So I'm a teacher. I'm sitting with two other teachers who I've just met today.
Hello.
And we did just want to make it very plain to everybody who may not be in the education system that it is a legal requirement for us to teach our students about the government, how the government works. It's part of their personal development. We already do it in PSHE. So I'm not quite sure what more education could be doing given the limited funding and opportunities, the massive, massive retention and recruitment crisis in education as well. What more education could be doing to not just engage but empower people, and also why it should be education's responsibility when Rishi Sunak has said, representatives of Rishi Sunak, I guess, have said that the government is not responsible for schools. Yeah. So I guess I would sort of question whether our political system has a real understanding of the material realities of people's lives in it and what more they can do to actually gain that understanding, because it's a question that's been asked at least 3 times and I don't feel has been particularly extensively addressed by the panel yet. And I realise we don't have much time.
Okay. Up there, is anyone up there who's got a question? Any other questions from up this part of the room? This is, oh, well, it's been decided. The communal. There you go.
Hi, my name's Jonathan. The issue for me is around centre of gravity. A lot of the focus here has been the political system, but the aim of the political system is to help define the needs, best interests of the population it serves and try and fix that. So to what extent could that be improved?
Okay, perhaps just one more before we wrap up. There we go.
Hi, Steve. I think what the person said over there, first question was about political culture, and what the gentleman said up there is interesting to do with institutions, and they're linked. So my question really would be to say that we don't have a democracy, we have a chumocracy with good chaps, and that's why the system's cracking and failing at the moment, because we don't have proper checks and balances. Our constitution is uncodified and relies on conventions and pulling things out of your ear and Henry VIII powers and all this kind of nonsense. So what we really need to do, and I wonder what the panel think about this, is democratise from top to bottom. So that includes a head of state that can actually function and actually be a check on power. The Queen failed to stop Boris Johnson proroguing Parliament when it was found to be unconstitutional, so that it literally failed at your job. That was your one job. You mucked it up, you didn't do it. We had the Owen Paterson scandal where they changed the rules for their mates at the time it was going on. If there was a statutory requirement in there, not swearing allegiance to the monarch is another one. So it is a question of democracy top to bottom, which includes reforming the House of Lords, which the Prime Minister acts as a king and puts his mates in there. They all do it, not particularly just Boris, but yeah. So it's about creating that democratic culture. It's not just about voting, it's about everything that we do. So I wonder what the panel think about that.
I have to say, when we started this, I didn't expect or anticipate the villain of the piece to be the late Queen, but there we go. That's the great thing about democratic events like this. We're having very little time, as you can see. In fact, we're completely out of it. So can I invite you all to sum up on a few of those themes that you might want to address?
Just a couple of those. So in relation to the last question about a chumocracy and good chaps theory, which has fallen apart, Unlock Democracy, we campaign for a written constitution for the United Kingdom, which would put in place, I think, the safeguards that you think and we think are necessary. On the question of centre of gravity, I think that we've had a lot of discussion about PR, and I think that is how you ensure that there is a centre of gravity, that you have more voices heard when those discussions around what policies are being developed and brought forward. In relation to, Jamie, the first point about standards in Parliament, we approached the Standards Commissioner and asked him to take action against Nadine Dorris after she had decided that she didn't need to do any work in Parliament. And the answer we got as to why he couldn't was because members of Parliament don't have a job description. So there's a clear and obvious answer to that, and that is to provide one and hold them to account on it. And finally, on the question of education, I think, yes, there is an issue that education is taught in school around politics. And I guess I think votes at 16 helps ensure that young people are then voting using the education they've already had in school, and then the evidence is that they continue thereafter to take part in electoral processes to a greater extent than they would do otherwise. So we need to continue with that education process.
Magid?
I guess to answer the teacher's point, I think, yeah, completely. I don't think people really do understand the material reality of what, in terms of teaching and everything else. I can completely second that point. And then gentlemen, completely top down, but I think also just the idea of having a people's assembly. So for me, as much as having a top down, I think also at the simultaneously having a bottom up approach, I think it's equally really, really important. And I guess the gentleman that was making the point about, yeah, we all have reviews in our kind of line of work. Why don't we have that within politicians? I think for me, it's not like people like Boris Johnson are the symptom of the problem. So I guess not necessarily just waiting until somebody like Boris Johnson can get away with everything that he's been doing. Like, I guess questioning the system that allowed Boris Johnson to actually, and fully well known who he was. We knew he'd been sacked many times for lying, but yet it still really just encouraged and supported somebody like him. So for me, it's trying to really crack, I guess, the kind of heart of the problem. And I think that kind of comes with massive reform. all across the board.
My answer to you, sir, about sort of, for instance, the Owen Paterson stuff is that the system worked in that it got rid of Boris Johnson. And I would also say I gave up my job and gave up my party because I could not follow Boris Johnson. But then the public gave him a huge majority. So be careful about, we have a democratic system. He put himself forward. He said, this is who I am, and the public voted for him. And to the gentleman at the top here, I would say, there's somewhere in this room, there will be people who are thinking about becoming MPs. They've now gone very quiet. And I don't want you to think that you shouldn't try to become a member of a parliament, because there's been quite a lot of attacks on members of parliament, and you used some pretty choice words, sir, and I knew 2 MPs who were killed in the line of duty. So we need to show some admiration for the courage that it takes. I left at the end of 2019. I was like, I've had enough. But some people go on and they really believe in what they're doing and they work hard for their constituencies. And we need more of those people to come forward. Thank you.
Scarlett, last word for you.
Okay. I think the education question was really cool and important. I work in climate education policy, so it very much aligns with my interest, and I only left school a year ago. We do learn about some things about the political system, but teachers are overworked and I think undertrained on these issues. It doesn't seem fair to expect a chemistry teacher, for example, to accurately teach kids about the political system, and I don't think this is something that can be solved from schools up. It needs to come the other way around. We need more funding for teachers, we need more training for teachers, and we also need to essentially fundamentally reevaluate how the education system is currently. It's so exams focused, it is not life focused, and that's only causing problems. I also think that, the gentleman who asked that question obviously didn't have that education whilst he was at school, and that raises the question of how do we educate people outside of schools about these things, because these issues affect, I'm assuming you're not at school, but all of you too, and I think that comes from the government making education out of school more accessible, whether that's government information schemes through the media and that sort of stuff, or even just making, those part-time college courses that I would say were a lot more prevalent about 15 years ago, bringing those back. I also think, I don't want to leave this on a bad note, I do agree with Amber that there are some MPs who actually genuinely care, who are doing amazing things in Parliament. And I also agree that we need more of them. And so the people in the room here who want to become politicians, I hope you do it. If you care about the climate crisis. If not, maybe not. I'm joking. But,
That's a lovely note to leave it on. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming along today. If you are... If you are going to attend any of the remaining events of this fantastic festival, then I hope you very much enjoy them. I hope you manage to get home somehow, and good luck with that. But enjoy the rest of the day, and please just give one final round of applause to the fantastic panel, Magid, Amber, Tom, and Scarlett. Thank you very much.
Welcome to LIFITV at the Leeds International Festival of Ideas. My name's Larry, and having just come off stage after, it got quite intense in there, I think it got a bit intense, at the Who Does Our Political System Benefit panel talk here at the Leeds Playhouse. Amber Rudd, Tom Brake and Scarlett Westbrook, thank you for coming in and having a chat. Did you find that it was a bit intense in there? Did you...
Yeah, I think the answer to the question is not for the audience as far as they were concerned. And they all had different ways of telling us that it didn't really feel like the political system was working for them at all.
Mm. Were you surprised by that? Do you get the sense that people are sort of angry with the political system? That's what it felt like in the audience to me.
I wasn't surprised. I think that quite accurately reflects the conversations that I have pretty much every day with people from all walks of life, whether that's, like an Uber driver, for example, or people in my class at uni and so many others.
I was in Manchester last night. We'll whisper it quietly because we're in Leeds now. And I was in a taxi to go to a concert, and of course the Conservative Party conference is on in Manchester. And the taxi driver had a few choice words for that as well, which I won't repeat on this.
Wise.
Very, very wise.
I think people have always, people really did hate MPs. I have forgotten how much they hate them. But I think that they've always, to a certain extent, Tom, don't you think, held them in low regard?
Well, as you may know, I think when Parliament burnt down in whenever it was 1830 odd, the crowds gathered to applaud on opposites. So yes, the MPs haven't always had a great reputation, but I wasn't surprised at people's reaction, because Unlock Democracy as an organisation, we do a lot of polling, and the polling clearly confirms things like 90% of the public believe they have little or no influence over government. So it wasn't surprising the way they responded.
I think it is very interesting how, unlike other countries, social media hasn't led to the same kind of idolizing of politicians. Like in the US, we have all of this social media narrative, for example, about like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And in other countries too, TikTok and Instagram and Twitter, there's kind of a celebrity culture of MPs almost in other countries that we don't seem to have quite adopted here.
I mean, that does reveal your preferences somewhat, Alexandra.
Not even necessarily because I like her, but she's got such a big social media presence.
She has, but there's also a lot of hate on there. There's huge amounts of hate,
and we don't have the same celebrity culture. And I don't know if that's because people are less engaged with politicians here, or if it's because of our social media habits.
Well, Michael Farrakhan's hair has its own Twitter account.
I think, unfortunately, it's possibly just a reflection of the bubbles that we all live in from a social media perspective. Because if I look at my Twitter feed, then the country would be overwhelmingly in favour of rejoining the European Union. But in practice, it isn't.
No, I think it is.
Well,
just have it confirmed.
Hopefully it will move that way, but at the moment it isn't. And I think one other aspect of social media, which I think is incredibly impactful for politicians, this came across in the session we've just had, is how, particularly for women and people from ethnic minorities, the very aggressive interaction that people have with their politicians is really something which we've got to try to address, because otherwise the only people who are going to want to stand are probably men who are quite secure, probably well off, and feel happy with being threatened on a daily basis.
Well, so I was going to ask about that. I was going to ask this a bit later, but it's come up straight away, the sort of hatred, you called it a hatred of MPs. And you referenced Jo Cox and Sir David Amess during the panel chat. And of course, we know, most of us, most reasonable people, I think, know that the discourse around politics has to improve. We have to do something about that hatred, and we need, new MPs with, sorry, you've become an MP now. I don't know if you knew that. That happened. Amber sorted it out.
Yes. Come on, Scarlett, join.
So, we need to do something about that. Yet, just yesterday, I think it was, Lee Anderson was on Twitter being fairly nasty to Carol Vorderman. Now, however they disagree on their politics, that responsibility goes both ways, doesn't it?
It does go, but I must say, Carol Vorderman is also very nasty back.
She's, but to be fair to her, she's not a standing member of Parliament, is she?
No, she's not. She's not.
No, but you may be absolutely right.
She has a public profile,
but the responsibility goes both ways, which is my point.
I do agree with your main point, which is that politicians should also take responsibility for not using divisive language, and I think that usually they do. I mean, I don't want to pretend that everything's to do with Brexit, but sort of Boris Johnson and Brexit changed that. And the language that he used to accentuate those divides has lasted to a certain extent. I mean, I don't think Rishi uses that sort of language, and Keir Starmer certainly doesn't, but and Ed Davey doesn't either, mustn't forget. But otherwise, there has been a coarsening of the language.
Yeah. I don't know what your experience is. You're writing policy. Are you in Whitehall somewhere? You're in amongst it there, and of course you've been in and amongst government, the both of you. Is it obviously you will see this anger day to day, and we know there are lots of things about politics that people are unhappy with. One of the things that came up tonight or this afternoon was to do with protest and restrictions on how much people can protest. Is it the case that in these corridors of power you have people who are in power, the highest power in the land? Do they ever sit there and think, should we talk about why people are protesting, rather than should we see if we can shut down these protests? It seems to me to be a bit backward,
I definitely think it does. It does seem that people, or politicians at least, think the latter more. It's more about how we shut down these dialogues instead of listen to them or increase them, all that sort of stuff. I do find it quite funny sometimes when I meet with MPs and they tell me, I'd never listen to the school climate strikers, for example, but you're so reasonable.
not knowing that I was one of the people who started the school climate strikes. You know, the school climate strikes weren't anywhere near the level of disruption as Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil, for example. But it really does seem in Parliament in particular that anybody who doesn't agree with the government is just like this loud, like raucous bunch of people we shouldn't associate with. I think it's super funny that people don't assume that I'm not in Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil, but I did, you know, protest every Friday back in the day when I was
every Friday. It's like the French, every Saturday.
I think we should be consistent, and if we are rightly attacking President Putin for running a regime which clamps down on the right to protest, then when the same thing happens in the UK, which it is, not quite to the same extent clearly as President Putin, but with the recent bills that have gone through, the Public Order Act, Police Crime and Sentencing and Courts Act, these are acts that have severely constrained people's right to protest, and also have added in risks for people who might not have been aware that there was a protest, for instance. So the penalty that people could pay now, they have to try to anticipate, could they really get in trouble, criminal charges for participating in peaceful protest?
I'm hoping to become a doctor, and you know that means that protests.
Is this after you've been an MP?
Or at the same time? That's your second job.
I think the MP thing's happening. But, you know, protests which I went to were just holding a placard and maybe chanting a bit. Doing something like that now would perhaps mean I would be struck off the GMC register, because that could give me a criminal record.
I just don't think that's correct.
It is, though, because in the new public order bill, the only reason that a police officer needs to arrest you is if you're causing serious annoyance. That's an exact quote. What is serious annoyance differs from person to person, but it doesn't have a clear legal definition. Like what I'm doing now is probably of serious annoyance, for example.
The noise issue, of course, I have been on a number of demonstrations since the last sort of 40 years, and I can't recall any demonstration that I was on where people weren't making noise.
It's kind of
so if you've now got a criteria that says you can't make noise disturbance, well, that's pretty much clamping down on anything apart from a silent protest where everyone has to walk with
the coronation.
Gag on it.
Didn't we see someone get arrested for holding a blank piece of paper?
I don't know, but can I just add, I mean, I think that it's sort of unwelcome in terms of, you know, the noise and the points that my colleagues here are making. But I think to compare it to Putin is completely crazy.
Well, I didn't compare it to Putin. I said it wasn't as bad as Putin, but I think it was moving in that direction.
No, I don't think it's going that direction. I think that the fact is we still do have the right to protest strongly. And the idea that sort of letting people think that we don't still have the right to protest, to go on marches, to make our voices heard, it happens still a lot. There was a pro-EU one just last week in Westminster.
Indeed, but people now have to make that conscious calculation of what risk are they of picking up a criminal charge or criminal conviction for participating in a protest.
Yes, they do. They have to make that assessment.
And that wasn't the case a few years ago.
No, that has been the change.
And I welcome the fact that one of the pieces of legislation that Labour have said they would reverse is some of the protest legislation.
This legislation also means who can protest differs wildly even, because if you're of a wealthier background, for example, if you're in a position that doesn't require you to be DBS checked, you know, that sort of stuff. And also if you're of a demographic that isn't, you know, facing police brutality as much, you're more likely to be able to vote now. That means essentially wealthier white men, rather than, you know, people of colour, people who are poorer, people who work in the public sector. And I think that means that the people whose voices are being heard, or at least being spoken, is changing too.
Let's move on from the protest issue, just to sum up here on, because one of the final questions that you had on the panel tonight was about hope. And of course, we've immediately, haven't we, got into the weeds on some stuff where you feel like the argument could just go on and on and on. And there has to be, to quote Harvey Milk, you know, you've got to give them hope. There has to be some way forward, doesn't there? So I'm not saying there's a silver bullet, but it, you know, is proportional representation in the mix? Could compulsory voting be a thing? Is there a reduction in the voting age? You know, all of these sorts of things. How ambitious do we have to be as a nation to bring in some hope into our political system?
Ooh, I think that we need to be quite ambitious. I don't know if mandatory voting is the answer. I don't think that criminalising more stuff that ever really helps. But we need to look at why people aren't voting and address those issues, whether that's more accountability for politicians, an increase of the franchise, looking at different voting systems. There's a whole wealth of ideas here, and I think we need to stop thinking about trying to maintain things as they are, but instead figure out ways to make them better. Whenever we talk about things like the climate crisis, for example, the conversation is always about how we keep our current standard of living. It's never how do we improve it, how do we have good ideas and innovation and technology to actually make things better for us all.
Well, I mean, Tom and I were sort of told off for doing too much of the talking, so it's good to hear a long answer from Scarlett. But I think there is hope, and I think that, I think in the new crop of MPs, there's quite a lot of young innovation and thinking that will be able to tackle some of these big problems quite well. I know that Tom will talk about PR. I do think there's room for improving the way we access democracy, which might be through PR. It's definitely through the House of Lords. But I also think that to think that the problem is our constitution rather than the problems that we have with delivering as a government, whoever that government is slightly a sort of displacement theory practice. I think that it is hard at the moment. It is hard to deliver a positive economy on Brexit. It is hard to address the climate transition, the energy transition. And I think that politicians and anybody else don't do the public a favour by pretending these things are straightforward and have an answer. I think it's much better to say these are complicated. These are how we think we're going to handle them. And I don't think that reforming our constitutions is going to be the answer.
Well, I think the great news for democracy is that people actually want it. A point I made earlier is that we don't have millions of people making their way to Russia or to China or to North Korea to take advantage of the fantastic democracy, civil liberties and freedoms that are on offer there. So people want democracy, and the polls are consistent about that. And I think there are certain things that we can do to boost people's confidence in democracy. And we talked about some of those in terms of holding MPs to account better, making sure that ministers are in a position to deliver, because I think that is what people expect from their democracy. They're entitled to expect their democratically elected politicians to deliver for them. And there has been very little delivery in recent years. But I think if we can turn that around and we can start to see perhaps a consistent long-term approach towards politics and delivery of policies, which PR would play a key role in, then I expect people's view and perception of democracy to improve significantly.
But you can't. The issue is also that people want better services, a better state, more support, less university fees, you were saying. But they also don't want higher taxes or a bigger state. There just is a problem here. And we have to acknowledge that you can't have one without the other. And we mustn't think that there's a kind of fantasy world when politicians who are, according to perhaps some of the people we heard earlier, better people can therefore deliver better outcomes. It's hard to deliver good outcomes. And the vast majority of MPs I knew were really committed to trying to do that. And it's just not that straightforward to deliver.
I feel like Tom came very close to saying long-term decisions for a brighter future there. I thought any moment now. So just to wrap up then, my name's Larry Budd and I'm a Twitter addict or an ex-addict now, or whatever it is. How important is an event like the Leeds International Festival of Ideas in terms of getting these conversations in a room, discussing them reasonably as a group of people and not just having these rows on Twitter that we referred to earlier?
I think that it's really important. It's brought people together from all across Leeds, as we got to experience today. I think that the context of it meant that it was a bit safer almost, because, I don't really see someone jumping onto the stage to attack someone in this particular environment. I think that's important too. I think all of us here would have experienced death threats at the very least, and God knows what at worst. So I think that makes it a safe environment too. And I also think that the audience were really engaged. Whether that's in a more intense way or not, we still had the engagement there, and I think that most of the questions were answered fully and wholly.
It was a huge privilege to be part of it today and to have a proper conversation debate. I agree with Scarlett, the audience were engaged. On X, people are so angry, back and forth, small amounts of words, and immediately assuming the worst about you if you try and engage with them. So it was great to be able to have that discussion and to meet fellow panellists. Of course, I knew Tom before, but I haven't met Scarlett before, so that was great. So I hope everyone else enjoyed it as much as I did.
And we were questioning what the future of democracy is. Well, I thought the event that we've just had was a very good representation of how democracy should work. So a panel which was civil to each other, an audience which were clearly engaged and were asking some challenging questions in an environment where they could do that. There are lots of countries in the world where that would not have been possible.
It's important to remember that, I agree.
Tom, Amber and Scarlett, thank you for being part of the Leeds International Festival of Ideas, and thank you for watching LIFITV.